What I am about to read to you is a review of one of the biggest shonen manga series, and I want you to figure out which series it's referring to in your mind as I read it. Quote, Blank started out as a very promising character-driven manga with several great arcs. It's a massive shame it didn't keep up. The story starts with a bang, builds and builds, wraps up in the first few arcs in a satisfying manner, then trips over itself, rolls down a hill into the ocean, and sinks into the abyss. I can say I was thoroughly disappointed with the way it ended after the potential it showed at first. It was a true shame once again to have a shonen series fall victim to this. It left a terrible aftertaste. If you have an answer, I want you to hold on to it for just a little bit longer. One of the things that fascinates me about modern manga is how frequently we get endings to major players that turn out to either be disappointing or not well received. My Hero Academia, JJK, Hopefully Rent a Girlfriend, and Oshinoko are a few of the big ones, with others like Kaiju number 8's upcoming ending not looking to fare well with all the general blandness that many criticize it for. Not only that, but many manga also receive massive delays with tons of amazing series on hiatus like Hunter x Hunter or Vagabond. So today I like to explore why so many manga fall off, fail to deliver, or never get finished at all, along with shining a spotlight on what I believe to be the main culprit of all of this. My name is Josh, I'm the host of Beyond Media, and this is why manga endings will continue to fail. But before we get into the rest of the script, this video was sponsored by me. Before YouTube, I actually used to try to write articles on the website Medium, which is a place where anyone can start writing articles and talk about whatever they loved. I started again, and the first link in the description is actually something I wrote talking about how I started YouTube. I'd like to use it as sort of a private journal, talking about everything I've learned about YouTube, writing, or analysis, so if that interests you, go ahead and follow me there. And hopefully the story of how we started YouTube will be interesting to you. Anyway, manga as a medium has always been one of the most fascinating in storytelling for me. While often used in the same sentences or used interchangeably with anime, they are completely different mediums. Manga has the ability to bridge and connect several different skill sets that is incredibly unique and many times require a very different toolkit than something like a novel. While it does have its limitations, manga is able to break free from some of the weaknesses of its peers, not requiring descriptions or lengthy prose or stimulating animation, with panels that are able to be manipulated and abused to create something completely unique in any other expression of storytelling. Paneling is one of the greatest strengths of this medium that has a very specific charm, often being able to communicate the very core of what a scene is doing better than any other, an oppressive hand reaching down, so domineering that it breaks free from the white borders in order to cover the other images of the story. Small boxes organized in a choppy yet connected way that is able to thread together an entire fight, while communicating how fast, dominant, and visually beautiful of a battle that it was. Phenomenal manga not only takes advantage of the expressive art within the confines of a box along with its relation to others, but also the infinity of white between the images themselves. Just like in this exchange of Guts fighting where we see his reaction, his strain, then the massive sword that follows, communicating how quick his reaction time and capacity for violence is. There are, of course, limitations to this ability to communicate. One of my favorite examples of anime being able to take manga and force it into brilliance is something like Tengen's musical score technique, which requires exposition and paneling in the manga, but in the anime is used to generate even more hype or momentum, or in music anime like K-On! Or Bocchi the Rock. However, those limitations of a frozen image, the white between artwork, the need for a page to actually be turned, or the lack of convenient exposition opportunity brings with it a massive slew of complications. There are a ton of inherent limits that exist within this medium, however those very limitations are what allow these artists to push what is conceptually possible within this medium. In fact, the very existence of limitations in any art form is what generates the most volatile growth and innovation. I think that there's a reason that even though video games, for example, are free of the limitation of old pixel graphics and are able to tell stories that are visually stunning and compelling, something like Undertale, A Void Stranger, or Fear and Hunger are still able to contend and stand with them due to all the other strengths that those very limitations have created. Within this art form though, which restriction of manga do you think has shattered the most coal and produced the most diamonds? If the constraints for art is what allows it to so often flourish and maintain its uniqueness, what is the X factor for manga? I think you'd be hard pressed to find someone that disagrees that the endless time crunch is the most brutal and devastating limitation that these creators are often forced to adhere to. Whether because of the magazine itself or the pressure from fans, mangaka often work tireless hours to ensure their stories come out on a weekly basis. Regardless of what you think of any individual mangaka, this level of pressure and dedication is respectable. The fact that so many of these creators endure for this long is nothing less than inspiring. Many of these authors often become self-destructive, winding up hospitalized for long periods of time or barely eating or sleeping to ensure that their work is of the highest quality. I mean, imagine this scenario for me, right? You are a fledgling potter, finally taking up the title after getting a little bit of work. And by fledgling, I mean you've made a few things here and there, but you really have no experience. However, once you make your first pot, people start to notice, and it's actually good. And I mean really good. In fact, so is your second one, and your third. And eventually people start to realize that you're so good, they travel from across the world just to see you come in every day and create your pottery. They watch you mold and bake and paint and eventually display your hard work. But then, suddenly, you get asked to switch to making vases. It's not unreasonable, I guess. You've made pots and people seem to love those, so you start to make vases. And they do pretty well. People still like them. But as thousands begin to watch you every day, the pressure starts to add up and become more and more oppressive. And as you work, people actually start to condemn your work. They point out all the little mistakes or issues in your craft until slowly but surely, the thousands are still there. But it seems like none of them have anything nice to say. In fact, they even start looking at your old pots and telling you that those weren't even that good in the first place. The potter here has a name. In fact, this fake little scenario mirrors a real-life person who was forced to survive under the relentless eyes of his audience and the weekly pressures of the industry. And that person's name is Gege Akutami. Akutami had one of the most successful breakout serializations that there had been in a long time. JJK took over the online sphere, winning Anime of the Year and permanently damaging the minds of anyone with Instagram and Twitter with Lobotomy Kaisen roaming the streets of the internet. Akutami had only published 3 one-shots before JJK 0, which ended up laying the groundwork for Jujutsu Kaisen. In each and every one of these one-shots, you can see what is quite incredible development for only the small amount of education he had in both writing and art. His first one-shot, Kamashiro Soza, compared to JJK 0, is a stark difference in quality that took place only across a 3-year time span. Each iteration of his work across the one-shot shows off both Akutami's affinity for action, along with his love of these supernatural monsters, intertwining with everyday— Is that Yuji? What? Huh. Anyway, while his one-shots even before JJK 0 were relatively well received, none of them spanned longer than 50 pages. That might sound like a lot for a newer artist, and it is, but compared to the overwhelming pop culture phenomena that he was about to create, which spans roughly 6,000 pages, each of his one-shots were their own little thing, and were allowed to be freely worked on without the limitations of the natural ones that come with the medium. JJK 0 then marked the beginning of the multicultural tsunami that none of us could have prepared for, with the one-shot not only needing to be drastically changed, but forcing Gege to abandon much of the story he wanted to tell due to the magazine not allowing him to. Pretty much none of what happens in JJK 0 was Gege's original vision for the story. He was forced to make the setting in a school to allow the one-shot to be published at all. In a Q&A back in 2021 regarding the creation of JJK, Gege responds to how much of the story needed to be altered because of the school's setting. Quote, "These alterations gave me the opportunity to change my way of writing manga and learn to focus more on character. Beforehand, I would usually think of stories in terms of plot only. I couldn't understand all those manga writers who claimed in their interviews that they felt like their characters were moving all by themselves. I always thought, what the hell are they talking about? Thinking about myself, I always thought about it in terms of plot at the beginning and in the middle before I could even think about the character's involvement. When I had no choice but to change everything all at once, I had to revise my storyboard fast while disregarding any pre-established storyline. It changed my way of thinking greatly. From there, I decided to make other characters evolve around the protagonist, Yuta Akotsu, and followed suit with developing their interactions. The experience was educational," end quote. If you've ever tried to write a story of a significant length, then you know just how challenging it can be to manage even just one plotline over even just 100 pages. The skill set required to make a short story or a one-shot interesting share a fundamental consistency with longer narratives, and yet both require completely different skill sets in order to make work. Short bursts of narrative are the pots, and JJK was Akutami's first vase. I think this explains why even though JJK as a series starts and has a dip in quality toward the end, pockets like the beginning of the story or the hidden inventory arc are held in much higher regard than everything else that follows Shibuya. JJK's serialization not only had Akutami needing to grapple with and develop the skills to handle a long narrative with incredibly interwoven character arcs, mysteries, and creative plot points, but also now deal with the endless pressure of weekly release. I'm sure at the beginning the pressure, while stressful, started out exciting, and the fact that both the manga and the first season of the anime were so well received did a great job to bolster his motivation. However, the series ran for 6.5 years, and after a while, that pressure started to mount, and the voices that used to cheer now started to feel more like condemnation or disappointment. I mean, just think for a second about the job that you currently work right now. If thousands of people showed up every day to judge, often negatively, sometimes with death threats on how good of a barista or a sales associate you were, along with you not receiving ample time to complete tasks, or this being the department you really didn't even want to work for in the first place, how long could you last before you cracked under the pressure, gave up, or just stopped caring as much? Even more so, the pressure on Nakatomi would be increased, with JJK taking over the internet during and after the run of the second season of the anime. I believe that the Culling Games marks about where Nakatomi stopped making pots and started to need to craft a vase. Sure, you still used clay, you still baked it, you still painted it however you wanted, but it is still a different item, and it requires different skills and experience. There's a lot of online discourse about Gege's skill as a writer. Many people say that calling Nakatomi good, and by extension JJK a great story, is either unwarranted or just a crime against storytelling. Lots say that he's disappointing and unskilled, or that he completely just stopped caring. But if we take into account everything we've talked about thus far, Gege Nakatomi is one of the most talented authors that you might be able to reasonably imagine. With only a few one-shots under his belt, he developed a concept that people absolutely loved. With no experience in long arcs or even forethought into his characters before JJK, he was still able to craft characters and part of a long narrative that people believed to be strong. The reason that someone like Eiichiro Oda is so skilled and respected isn't because he plans out every little thing in One Piece. In fact, I think saying something like that undersells how talented of a writer he is and why I think he's one of the most skilled creators that have ever lived. Rather, his greatest skill is the ability to have an idea for a character or an arc that previously didn't exist or existed differently in the outline, and then being able to execute on it in a way that keeps his series fresh and exciting. And I think that finally brings me back to the original review that I opened the video with. Now, you would believe me if I told you that review was written about JJK, but it's not. That was written all the way back in 2016 regarding another shonen series that had ended, that being Tite Kubo's Bleach. Despite Bleach solidifying its legacy in the Big Three and being one of the most well-respected and influential manga shonen to ever have been made, it currently sits with about as many ratings as JJK, but also with a lower score, which places JJK above it in terms of community support. I truly believe that in 10, 15, 20 years, a lot of the endings that got hate or the stories that got picked apart will either be seen as brilliant or much better than we give them credit for. Demon Slayer's blandness, My Hero or JJK's ending, Chainsaw Man Part 2. I think that all of these will receive way more love when there's enough time to take a serious step back and look at everything holistically, without a wave of immediate general opinions sweeping the internet, or without leak culture ruining everything. Now, that isn't to say all critiques of the series are invalid. A lot of them hold weight, and I believe still will hold weight in the future. But I also think that understanding the climate and the times we're in should help us approach art with our own viewpoint, or even with the viewpoint that is willing to grapple with things more holistically. One of the things I think causes critique or misunderstanding of someone like Gege or Fujimoto or Horikoshi's writing skill in the week-to-week is how the Western mind consumes art. Comparing manga to something like a novel is distinctly unfair and manages to undercut what makes a great mangaka great in the first place. Perhaps a skill more powerful than storytelling in the West is the ability to properly revise a story. It's one of the most important tools you can have as a writer. So much so that Professor of Writing, Rhetoric, and Linguistics Alice Horning writes this about revision in Chapter 8 of her book titled Revision, History, Theory, and Practice. An excerpt from the chapter reads, quote, "No professional writer would ever consider submitting for publication or professional review a piece of writing that has not been thoroughly revised. Authors in the West have a distinct advantage over mangaka, as their work is always published in a full draft. They can write the book, revise as many times as they think needed, then turn it into an editor for feedback, and do more revisions. The most successful fantasy author of the modern day, Brandon Sanderson, implements a 5-draft revision system that sometimes requires up to a year to complete. The initial draft, the major changes draft, a couple of feedback drafts, then the final draft. On and on it goes until the story is told. The chances of writing an excellent story on the first draft is so impossible in the Western world that no professional would even consider it, yet it's pretty much the standard for mangaka in the East. Yes, they have their first drafts and concept designs, editors, and feedback in manga, but it's nowhere near the time or space needed to actively revise and perfect a long-running story or arc. Without the ability for manga authors to look at their story in full, get feedback, and make changes, many things will naturally slip through the cracks. You're essentially asking someone to nail it on the first try, which not even the best in the world can do. Even legends need revision. It takes a generational talent and master of the craft in order to do this successfully. These are people like Oda with One Piece, or arguably Isayama's Attack on Titan. All that to say, when a book in the West finally hits the shelf, it has been revised and changed so many times, and yet you will still never find a perfect book. As a side note that I'm considering dedicating a whole video on, I think this is a major technical reason that a lot of female characters in shonen end up getting pushed to the side or hitched to a character to maintain presence. It's a way for the author to at the very least try and keep her active in the plot, maintaining long arcs, with the bulk of their focus being on the male characters that the shonen audience is designed to relate to. If you want a video on this topic, comment about it and I'll be able to gauge if people care about it or not. Regardless, the reason I say endings continue to fail isn't inherently because endings can't be done well or can't succeed. I think Horikoshi is a great example of him revisiting the ending when he has more time to round up some of the loose ends, but I say it because it's baked into the very limitations of the medium. In the same way that novels are constrained to words or songs are restricted by rhythm and tempo, manga is restricted by time. And I think when you look at it that way, it almost becomes amazing what the greats are able to accomplish. I believe that art demands empathy while it's being created. In one form or another, any piece of fiction that dares to tell a story with the intention to be loved needs to approach itself with a sense of seriousness and care. It requires someone to be able to think so individually and specifically of their craft that they begin to see things and topics in the abstract. In a way, there's a lot of pressure on the artist to hold all the empathy for both their art and the people who view it. But I also believe there's a part of the story and the art that requires empathy from the viewer as well. Reading stories and observing them and interacting with them is a privilege. Art is a privilege, and I think seeing and understanding it as such is not just vital for the author, but for the reader as well. I hope this video shared some of that empathy for the artist that I believe more people should enter a story with. It doesn't mean to omit criticism or not call it a mistake when it's there, but to understand why a mistake like that could be made by someone who was really trying their best. If you enjoyed this video, you might like the one we previously uploaded that you can check out right here. And until next time, keep dreaming.